Yes.
Okay, well, now that the first semifinal debate has concluded, we welcome the debate teams that will compete in the second semifinal debate, Davidson Academy of Nevada versus Westwood High School of Texas. So this time, I'd like to ask the debaters to please introduce themselves.
So I am Winston Yan, a senior at the Davidson Academy.
I'm Adi Patwa, a sophomore at the Davidson Academy.
I'm Julia Burnham, a senior at the Davidson Academy.
I'm Pranab Balakrishnan, a junior at Westwood.
I'm Ayush Tripathi, a senior at Westwood.
I'm Eric Zhu, a senior at Westwood.
Let's give these students a round of applause. Well, once again, moderating this round will be Mr. David Baker, Director of Admission and Financial Aid at St. Mark's School of Texas. And now to introduce our judges. Mr. Dave Houston has coached debate for over 40 years and has been a part of the IPPF competition since its second year. He serves on the IPPF Advisory Board, the IPPF Topic Committee, and he regularly judges the IPPF written and oral competitions. Mr. Houston's also a long-standing member of the National Speech and Debate Association Board of Directors. Mr. Houston's debate teams have won numerous state, regional, and national competitions. He is an Emory University Barkley Forum Key Coach, a member of the Texas Forensic Association Hall of Fame and the NSDA Hall of Fame. Ms. Svetlana Eisenberg is a partner at Brewer Attorneys and Counselors. Prior to joining the firm, she served as a law clerk to the Honorable Michael E. Wiles of the Southern District of New York. Between 2014 and 2017, Ms. Eisenberg served as an assistant United States attorney in the civil and criminal divisions in the District of New Jersey. In that position, she conducted grand jury investigations into financial and other crimes. She also previously served as Associate General Counsel in HSBC's Global Internal Investigations Group and as an associate at DeVoy and Plimpton. Mr. Trey Smith is the Executive Director and Principal of East Mountain High School, one of the top public high schools in New Mexico. He served as New Mexico District Chair of the National Speech and Debate Association for a decade and coached multiple teams to the Elite 8 rounds of the IPPF. A two-diamond coach with the NSDA, he coached over 80 students to the national tournament. Mr. Smith is a member of the IPPF Advisory Board. A round of applause for our judges, please. A quick reminder to please silence your cell phones, and with that, I will turn things over to Mr. David Baker.
Thank you very much, Andrea. We're ready to start. If the judges are ready, we will start with the opening speech by the affirmative for a period of 8 minutes. You may begin.
Before I begin, I'd like to express our deepest thanks to the Brewer Foundation for making this discourse possible. We'd also like to extend our thanks to New York University and our judges today for joining us. We'd like to recognize the roles that our teachers, coaches, alumni, and parents have played in our path to getting here. And I'd lastly like to congratulate the negative for making it to the round of to the Final Four. With that, I will begin. Countries across the world are facing the combined issues of poverty, inequality, and the push for economic development in globalized economies. More specifically, the most dire examples of these issues are found in the 75% of countries that make up the developing world, where both extreme wealth and extreme poverty coexist. Take Kenya, for example, which has one of the fastest growing super rich populations in the world, and yet 38% of its citizens live in multidimensional poverty. In this environment, universal basic income, or UBI, as a policy investment, has the power to both relieve poverty and build strong domestic economies through its unique qualities. We posit UBI's main strengths over other programs to be the lack of targeting requirements leading to the broader coverage of those most in need and the immediate and proven benefits to citizens' health and safety and the long-term advantages of offering cash transfers instead of in-kind goods and services. A policy that grows local economies and takes advantage of spending multipliers to maximize the efficacy of limited government budgets. What we specifically propose is a low-cost micro-UBI that will be distributed to all citizens regardless of age and work, primarily to alleviate extreme poverty, being the most effective in the majority of countries that make up the developing world. We define extreme poverty using the UN's international line of living on less than $2.15 of US dollars a day, a condition wherein citizens struggle to pay for basic survival necessities such as food and sanitation. For countries looking to eliminate extreme poverty, the majority of aid is spent on food aid and other in-kind transfers to cover citizens' base needs. By nature of size, this UBI would not necessitate the replacement of other forms of social spending or be intended to be a substitute for specific ongoing developmental efforts, such as investments in infrastructure. To articulate how UBI will achieve its first goal of widespread coverage, we must examine the benefits of universality. Universality allows countries to completely eliminate targeting issues and the bureaucracy needed to implement similar direct cash transfer programs. This avoids the common failure of cash transfer programs to reach those in need for those who need them most, as demonstrated in Mexico, where studies found that the poorest households were actually the most likely to drop out of conditional cash transfer programs, given the difficulty of qualification. The need for targeted aid is also less relevant when a large portion, if not the majority of the country, would qualify for aid programs anyway, such as in Ethiopia, where almost 69% of the population already lives in multidimensional poverty. Under these circumstances, cutting away bureaucracy in favor of simply distributing a UBI to every citizen allows countries to streamline their aid processes, especially in countries where a large portion of those living in poverty come from rural and undereducated areas. The lack of applications and qualifying conditions is vital to reach those who may not know about or be able to participate in conditional programs. The immediate benefits provided by providing a UBI policy in this way cannot be understated. Short-term impacts are the reduction of starvation and improvement of health in the nation's poor, as demonstrated by one of the largest UBI programs in the developing world, the Namibian Basic Income Grant Program. The Namibian Basic Income Grant Program, or BIG, was trialed for 2 years, wherein citizens within selected regions would receive 100 Namibian dollars, or just about $5 USD per month. At the start of the program, 76% of recipients lived below the poverty line. Just a year later, this number dropped to only 37%, a staggering transformation. The proportion of underweight children went from 42% to 10%, while both school dropout rates and crime rates dropped over 40% each. These benefits even came with no evidence of an increase in alcoholism and saw a 25% decrease in unemployment. As a result, over 8 out of 10 Namibians support the official adoption of the program, and a nationwide rollout of the BIG formed part of the national 2016 to 2015 plan, which could be wholly funded by less than a 7% increase in a value-added tax. On the topic of funding, what programs like the Namibian BIG illustrate is that UBI programs can have a large impact without requiring a large budget. In India, for example, cash payments of only $2.80 a day were enough to cause broad increases in both nutrition and sanitation for recipients. Implemented nationally as a UBI, this program would cost less than 2% of India's GDP, a fraction of current social spending, thus enabling its coexistence with other forms of social spending. In Colombia, a similar $50 monthly UBI would cost under 1% of its annual GDP, reiterating the feasibility of these programs across the globe. Given its short-term impacts and financial feasibility, where UBI seals the deal is in its unique ability to foster economic development. Citizens can fill up their stomachs equally well using a soup kitchen or a UBI, but only a UBI leads to long-term economic stability. When government-provided services cut out middlemen to aid, in doing so, they often unintentionally smother out local businesses and prevent meaningful development. A common example of this is how well-natured clothing donations, largely sent to Africa, have destroyed local textile businesses in Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and thus entrenching communities in further cycles of poverty. This effect is even worse when distributing food aid to those in extreme poverty, as poverty is most often concentrated in rural areas where the majority of citizens work as farmers. UBI, on the other hand, increases demand for local products and encourages the development of trade across neighboring communities, bridging developmental gaps. This was illustrated in Africa, where an analysis of 7 cash transfer programs found that every dollar transferred to families generated up to $2.50 of extra income to the local economy. Taking these spending multipliers into mind, UBI quickly becomes an overwhelmingly favorable policy, eliminating bureaucracy, quickly plummeting poverty and malnutrition, and evening out economic development are all possible with UBI's simple yet impactful structure. We therefore affirm the resolution and urge the adoption of low-cost UBIs as a powerful policy to eliminate extreme poverty and increase the speed of economic development, the first step to usher in an age of truly universal prosperity. Thank you.
Thank you.
All Before I begin, I'd like to extend a brief thank you to everyone who made this weekend possible, the Brewer Foundation, NYU, and all the judges who came out to adjudicate. I know your time is extraordinarily valuable. Thank you so much for being here today. I'd just like to thank Mr. Henderson, our coach, for organizing and preparing for us all season for debates like this. I'd also like to thank our opponents, Davidson. We look forward to a really exciting debate, and congratulations making it to this round. I'd also like to thank the Westwood Policy Debate Squad, Ishan, Sahil, Madhavan, Ian, and my partners, both Erics, Ayush, and Ethan. Additionally, I'd like to thank my parents for supporting my debate career and being one of the main reasons that I'm able to be here today. All right, now to begin. In 2016, Mike Dunleavy ran on the campaign platform of increasing Alaska's permanent fund dividend. He did not explain how he would fund it, nor how the budget would balance. All he claimed was that Alaskans would see a bigger check. He won by a landslide. As Robin's son Lee, a master's in public policy writes, the PFD allowed Dunleavy to turn the governor's race into a single-issue vote. It allowed a feckless politician to capitalize on residents' economic insecurities and reach the state's highest office. To fulfill his promise, Dunleavy cut healthcare, education, infrastructure, Medicaid, Alaska's critical ferry system, public broadcasting, and universities. A UBI is the pinnacle of irresponsible policy by destabilizing government budgets and causing massive inflation. Thus, we negate government should not provide universal basic income. First, we will establish the frames and burdens to evaluate the round. The affirmative must defend the most common implementation of basic income. When we look at whether we should do a policy, we must factor in every potential effect of it, such as political trade-offs. Ignoring political trade-offs would insulate our debate from political reality. A core issue that every policymaker considers is the worst-case incidental trade-off of their policy. If a government does have excess money it wanted to spend, that money would be better spent on these alternatives. First is conditional cash transfers. They target vulnerable parts of the population, enabling them to have special care while using a tiny portion of the budget. It also prevents wide-scale spending from the population by only increasing demand in one area of the economy, while current problems with welfare could be remedied by reducing the qualification requirement to low income. Second, investment in government services. Governments could increase spending, which would allow governments to access critical services such as electricity, running water, healthcare, and education. Now to discuss welfare trade-off. Cash blurs out every other critical government service, causing a slew of irresponsible spending and budget cuts. Voters will forget or be lied to about the trade-offs with every other service, while politicians won't increase taxes for fears of political backlash. A basic income's massive price tag would force cuts to welfare. As Robert Greenstein, an expert on U.S. welfare policy, writes, in the United States, a $10,000 basic income would cost 3/4 of the entire federal budget and close to 100% of all yearly tax revenue. In effect, Alaska's basic income took from the poor and gave to the rich. It liquidated public services that traditionally gave everyone a minimum opportunity in favor of $400 a month. At a national level, a basic income would still require massive cuts on Social Security, Medicare, food stamps, tax credits, and unemployment insurance, programs that have served as a shield against poverty. All of these programs are worth far more than basic income because they focus strictly on the poor. And for example, Social Security gives more than a basic income at $1,200 per month on average. Additionally, it's nearly impossible to enforce taxes in developing countries, which suffer from rampant tax evasion and fear that investors will leave their country. As a result, developing countries on average collect half the taxes as a percentage of GDP as developed countries. Finally, taxes hurt economic growth. They decrease valuable investment by the rich while preventing people from wanting to work because they only receive a small portion of the pre-tax income. Next, to discuss inflation. A basic income would be catastrophic for the economy. It would cause rampant inflation, increasing poverty across the board. First, it would decrease participation in the labor force. Nir Jamovich, a professor of economics, finds that UBI would allow people to live comfortably without working, which drives them to quit their jobs or work for less hours. Jamovich concludes that an American UBI would result in an 18% decline in GDP as businesses would be forced to increase wages, spend more money recruiting, and suffer from narrow profit margins. This decline in profitability would discourage growth and put millions out of work, worse off than before a UBI. Second, basic income would increase the velocity of money, regardless of how it was funded. Low-income people spend a higher portion of their income, so the basic income would cause a huge burst in spending, causing shortages in nearly every good and service in the economy. As businesses hiked prices to adjust, mass inflation would start to take hold of the economy. Finally, a basic income would be a global political crisis. It's so popular that it drowns out every other issue, and politicians will endlessly increase it to curry political favor. Mohammed Rasulinejad, writing for research papers in economics, finds that each candidate will promise higher UBI rates to gain more votes, which would produce a vicious cycle ending with hyperinflation. Case studies prove that this is extremely likely. In the US, Donald Trump bypassed standard IRS and Treasury procedures in order to get his name on stimulus checks during the COVID-19 pandemics, as he was desperate to claim that the cash handouts were from him. Maduro directed the Venezuelan central bank to print thousands of trillions of bolivars, causing an inflation rate of over 2,000% in order to maintain his campaign promise of benefits for all. It's clear that politicians will constantly increase the UBI, causing massive swings in price stability. Inflation and economic decline are worse under any ethical framework. A historical analysis of 133 countries finds that downturn increases interstate tensions. When there's low unemployment and growth, countries are more likely to become unfriendly because they become desperate. During recessions, inequality has risen twice as fast and the value of cash falls, which overwhelmingly favors the rich. Inflation makes a basic income useless. The simple fact that it makes cash less valuable means that people have been made no better off. Anything a basic income is good for requires a stable value of the currency, which becomes impossible during high times of inflation. Now to answer their case. Over the last generation, hundreds of millions of people have escaped poverty. Inequality is at an all-time low, and the future looks bright. Vincent Geloso, professor of economics, uses a model that accounts for political freedom, nutrition, income inequality, lifespan inequality, childhood survival, schooling, and material well-being, and hundreds of other indicators. He finds that over the last 30 years, the world has reduced inequality by over 34%, and that is without a basic income. Additionally, global economic growth, technology development, and massive increases in education have made future poverty reduction almost guaranteed, barring a collapse of governments and economies across the world. A 2023 report from the Center on Global Development in 2023 finds that extreme poverty will have effectively disappeared by 2050 across nearly every predicted scenario, accounting for worst-case climate change and recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. All pilot programs are inaccurate, including the ones they have cited in their paper. First, no pilot program can explain the political effect it would have on voters, as they didn't reach everyone in a country except for Alaska, which was a disaster, which we explained above. Second, the vast majority of pilot programs paid small amounts to a few people for a limited amount of time, so people needed to save a larger part of their income and spend more responsibly. In contrast, a national basic income would be permanent and give out more money per person, so people would know that they would get money later and would spend more now. Third, almost every program was funded by charities or aid organizations, not governments. When scaling up a basic income to be thousands of times larger, policymakers must go from relying on charity to cutting other parts of the budgets. Charities cannot tax, nor can they cut other welfare programs, so the ways that governments would fund a basic income would likely be substantially different to the way that pilot programs were funded. Their Namibia study is unrepresentative of the broad population. It was only given to one community, less than 1,000 people, and was financed by charities, not national revenues. Other pilot programs are about cash transfers, which conditional cash transfers fulfill better. Inflation and welfare trade-off are disastrous, which will exacerbate every harm the affirmative has presented. Thus, we negate. Governments should not provide universal basic income.
Thank you. We'll now have 90 seconds of preparation before the affirmative's second speech. That's the end of preparation time. The second affirmative speech for a period of 5 minutes. You may begin.
I I'd first like to reiterate and support our framework. We maintain our focus on developing low to middle income nations, not the US or developed economies. The negative has largely failed to interact with our target demographic of developing countries, which renders their evidence surrounding the Alaska Permanent Fund and Social Security inapplicable. Our proposal is a small, minimal UBI, and while we could argue the impact that $5 to $10 per person per month has in the US and Sweden, who already boast extraordinarily low extreme poverty rates, we want to put UBI where it can be impactful. Political infeasibility is not a concern. As we will explain, a micro UBI is beneficial due to its transparency and simplicity. 85% of the world's population lives in developing countries, so it is much more important to consider this demographic as it dominates in both magnitude and potential for impact due to the inequality present. If a UBI proves favorable in the vast majority of contexts, as is the case with developing nations, it is a favorable policy. By focusing on developed nations and using American-centric evidence, the negative is disregarding the international nature of this debate. Financial feasibility is not a concern for a micro-UBI. This policy would consist of a small fraction of a nation's GDP and social spending, leaving welfare cuts and taxation woes out of the picture. We do not argue for the replacement of existing welfare. Our proposed UBI is cheap enough to coexist alongside in-place systems, even acting as a supplementary form of aid to ensure no recipient misses out on financial assistance. Taxation is a very viable method of financing a UBI. The financial impact of relocation and tax evasion is often minimal, and increases in income taxes in Iran and Turkey have only resulted in avoidance costs of under 1% of their national GDPs. Funding measures necessitated by our UBI, which cost a third of any avoidance costs or tax evasion concerns, should render our financing measures unperturbed. Progressive taxation schemes and a UBI inherently would reduce inequality by effectively redistributing income across wealth gaps. The negative also brings up inflation as a point of discussion. The worry surrounding universal price increases upon the implementation of a UBI is unsubstantiated. As the Economic Times puts it, given that we live in market societies, the fear that this will lead to unchecked inflation is counterintuitive, since competition is supported by rising purchasing power and serves to check price increases. Universal cash transfers in Ugandan villages, for instance, resulted in no inflationary consequences. UBI instead stimulates real output through spending multipliers. UBI is not all-encompassing, and thus political disaster is a far-fetched hypothetical. UBI can coexist alongside targeted welfare initiatives and is small, meaning any political consequences are small. A UBI provides necessary and base-level aid which covers the gaps in existing targeted systems, and said systems can supplement extra costs like education. We advocate for the coexistence of both, a cheap UBI to cover everyone regardless of circumstance, alongside targeted alternatives to account for variation. Baseline universality is necessary, however, because it makes UBI easier to implement and manage than any other form of welfare and removes the worst-case scenario of people in extreme poverty receiving zero. This idea that extreme poverty will simply disappear is preposterous. Developing countries have tried to accomplish this for decades to minimal effect. Universal aid is necessary to solve the issue. Thus, the negative claims regarding crisis and extreme poverty are not applicable. It's evident that the core clash of this debate is universality. Should aid be distributed to everyone within a country? The answer is yes. Targeted aid, especially in low to middle income nations, often fails to reach those who need it due to poor infrastructure, and by definition always excludes someone who needs it. Only 22% of the poorest in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia receive any social assistance, and this failure to reach the impoverished is correlated with informality and poor data quality, inherent issues to developing countries. In these same countries, the majority of the population, often 50 to 80%, are classified as impoverished. To bridge this gap caused by targeted aid, a foolproof universal plan must supplement existing schemes. When so many people live in poverty, the marginal benefit of targeting decreases. Aid directed towards everyone fills the gaps of welfare coverage, and wasted aid is justified through UBI savings in administration. Because UBI is easier to set up, feasible, effective, and rises to the occasion where traditional welfare fails, it is the favorable policy. Thank you. Reaffirm.
Okay. 90 seconds before the second speech from the affirmative. From the negative, I apologize. That's time. Second speech by the negative for a period of 5 minutes. You may begin.
Providing a basic income would be catastrophic for governments around the world. The affirmative cannot simply, as they put it, wish for a cheap UBI. The program would cause irresponsible cuts in spending from governments, preventing the development of basic services and welfare. Politicians would exploit them by campaigning on increasing the basic income. Additionally, a basic income would be worse for the economy. It would reduce work not only by causing people to quit their jobs, but by also reducing the amount of hours that people work. The increase in the velocity of money and demand would signal to businesses to increase their prices, especially when politicians would opportunistically increase the basic income for votes. Inflation both negates the effects of basic income and increases societal tensions. Now, to answer their burdens, the resolution posits governments in general financing of a basic income, so ignoring developed countries does not faithfully read the resolution. But in developing countries, the welfare trade-off would be worse. Their tax systems are more inefficient, and they're often unable to get revenue without cutting other, more vital programs. Lina Levinas, a professor of welfare economics, finds that in Brazil, cash transfers were, quote, to the detriment of providing running water, sanitation, housing, equal standards in education, and healthcare. Even with extra money, 16% of the population have no access to tap water, whereas 32.7% of the population lack proper sanitation. Families with cash transfers will end up living in slums, making their lives prone to violence, police abuse, and disease. Even these measly cash transfers are too much for the budget. Brazil's conditional cash transfer program provided just $35 a month to a quarter of the population, while causing massive budget deficits and inflation, which proves that a small UBI causes a massive hit to the budget. Taxation is not politically viable. This is proven by how developing nations tax less than half of what developed countries tax as proportion to GDP. They're afraid of losing business investment in people and think that taxes are very unpopular. Now, as for welfare targeting, it is effective, as governments can currently provide services like running water, electricity, and healthcare programs, which do reach all populations. Also, there have been large advancements in technology for targeting, which will ease government's ability to identify who needs transfers the most. Second, imperfect welfare is far, far better than a perfect basic income, which would target exactly 1/4 of the government's budget towards the bottom quarter income people, which is far more unjust. Now, the economy is suffering from too much demand. Governments have spent trillions of dollars during the COVID-19 pandemic, while the Ukraine war and other conflicts have heavily stressed supply chains. In short, businesses don't have excess capacity, and they aren't capable of producing much more. Therefore, any increase in demand will be met with an almost exclusively increase in prices. As Ben Bernanke, a former chair of the Federal Reserve, puts it, he finds that stimulus and excess demand was the largest cause of inflation during the pandemic, which peaked as high as 10%. A basic income would be magnitudes worse, and it would be permanent rather than a few transfers and give a higher proportion of the GDP. There is no competition, as post-basic income, there would be a similar amount of productive businesses and far, far more people asking for certain services. Now, to move on to their case, inequality is globally decreasing, so there is no need to rush with hasty welfare policies. As countries make advancements in economic growth, technology, and education, while international aid and accessibility of funds is increasing in these governments, the services will start a new age of peace and equality, but only if the economy remains stable. Overcomplicating the budget would ruin all of that progress. The affirmative's assertion that developing countries have not made progress is asinine and has no evidence, while our study accounts for all future and past trends. Now, a basic income would also be independently bad for businesses. The average small business spends around $400,000 a year, something a basic income wouldn't be close to compensating. Their evidence, when it discusses our entrepreneurship, is actually describing freelance work where people work for themselves in gigs like Uber or personal writing. This kind of freelance work would be unproductive and unprofitable, but more pleasant for people to do. Because people could live on smaller wages, they would do more of this work, which would make the economy less productive. Additionally, high inflation and low growth would prevent people from starting new businesses by making the economy worse and more volatile. Now, all of their private pilot programs are inaccurate. No pilot program can explain the political effect that a basic income would have on voters. Additionally, none were permanent. People in pilots were substantially more likely to save their income and not quit their jobs while they knew that it would be taken away at some point. Indian programs were funded by organizations like UNICEF, who would be capable of supporting billions more people. Additionally, the way that governments would fund a basic income would be substantially different, since charitable organizations cannot tax or cut programs. Now, the Namibia example was only to 1,000 people, so what doesn't represent a national basic income by any means, as it was targeted only to one rural area. Many other pilot programs have also just been conditional. Many only gave to the poor or only to women, which proves that our argument that conditional transfers are better. The final empiric, which is Uganda, was extremely small. Adults only received 16 euros per month, which is not sufficient to live on. It also ended in 2023, and residents of Uganda knew that their income would not end, and so they saved and didn't quit their jobs. Inflation and welfare trade-off are catastrophic, and thus we negate.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll start the team cross-examination period now, just to remind both sides that everybody has to ask a question, everybody has to answer a question. And if you hop in on the back of somebody else's answer, that counts as an answer, okay? So, but just sort of whoever the team captains are, kind of keep up with that. I'd rather not interfere with it. So, we'll start with a question by the affirmative for the negative.
Perfect. We question the negative's proposal of solely welfare policies, which have notoriously been embroiled in extreme corruption in developing countries due to their often lack of transparency. In India, for example, over 60% of the food within the In-Kind National Food Security Act has been mysteriously lost through the complex chain of middlemen and black markets. A UBI, on the other hand, is completely transparent, as everyone knows how much they should receive, so losses are immediately apparent. How do you reconcile the corruption of welfare policies that greatly diminishes their efficiency to provide base aid over a UBI?
I can answer this question. So the first thing is that our endorsement is not of traditional targeted welfare that involves this kind of like food transfers. Rather, it is also cash transfers, just ones that are targeted towards the poor. It is very simple to set a goal of how much people under a certain income level would get, which means that the traditional problems with targeting welfare would not happen. The transparency element is the same for conditional cash transfers because the government could declare an income threshold at which people would receive their income and simply pay everyone who went below.
Okay, I guess I can take the first question for y'all. A basic income in the United States, for example, would cost about 3/4 of the yearly federal budget. Many developing countries are struggling to raise revenues due to large amounts of corruption and needing to spend on other necessities. So how would developing nations be able to fund the basic income?
So that's a great question. So I'm afraid that a lot of your case has been based on the $1,000 monthly UBI assumptions that are used mainly to describe a UBI in developed countries. What we're proposing is not that, but it's instead a base services UBI that covers the bare necessities such as food and sanitation. Now, the cost of this policy is incredibly low compared to cost of the policy in the US. For example, the US policy would cost 16% of the nation's GDP, which we admit is a lot. In comparison, the policies that we're proposing cost only a few percentage points, often 1 or 2%, of developing nations' GDP, which means that the cost simply can't be comparable.
I can take the next. Oh.
You'll get it.
I'll ask the next one. I ask, how will the negative implement targeted welfare in countries where the economy is largely informal and citizens' incomes can't be tracked by traditional means, especially given the ease of obscuration by dishonest actors?
I mean, I think that point kind of relies on a little bit of cherry picking. I think that there's a lot of defense on the case that suggests that welfare programs in developing nations are effective, poverty, inequality, and a bunch of other development indicators in large portions of Africa, Europe, and Asia are all suggesting that life expectancy and other forms of welfare are effective in, reducing the ills of poverty. And to add on, I mean, most of these developing nations already have a lot of nominal income data and information about its population, and that they would just build on that to expand these welfare programs.
I think you have misinterpreted the question. The question is, how will a welfare program be funded if it's impossible to tax these informal transactions, if you will?
Funding can occur through the same means as a standard basic income. I think you've proposed taxation, so conditional cash transfers could also be funded through taxation.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I guess, why would governments keep the basic income that low when historically every basic income that's been implemented at a national level has been increased by politicians?
I wouldn't compare this to every single UBI pilot that has been implemented historically, because this is small and because it's a base level of aid. So I doubt politicians would be inclined to support it to cater to this middle class, because we're providing a basic survival level UBI. I doubt this would have any political affiliation or any corruption bias per se.
Yeah. So I'd like to add on to that. I believe what you're talking about when you say every single basic income ever implemented by a country is Alaska, which A, is not a country, and B, is the only government or voting body in general to have ever implemented a basic income. And indeed, the Alaska income did have a fault where people voted to raise it, and yet people learn from their mistakes. We're asking for a long-term policy, and Alaska's blunder was quickly realized and remedied because voters are not necessarily so stupid as to not understand the trade-offs that their votes will have.
Question, either side?
The negative does not believe that a micro-scale UBI could possibly be inexpensive. To reiterate, the cost of an extremely low-cost UBI in India that we provided in our constructive, for example, a $2.80 per month UBI would cost less than 2% of India's GDP. We invite the negative to calculate this for themselves, and we ask, why is this not feasible?
So it is important to recognize that the lower the amount of the UBI also affects the amount that it prevents poverty. A $2.80 basic income, whilst it might help Indians a little bit, is not a sufficient amount of money for them to afford basic services. And additionally, these countries' populations are huge and their relative GDPs are smaller because they, make less money from businesses. So it would still cost a substantial amount of their money.
Could I add on to that, if I may?
Sure.
In India, for example, people get by basic living necessities on $1.90 per day. Your assumption that it costs a lot to keep someone alive is simply false. This is why we propose such a small UBI. We can get a lot of results with very little spending, and
So
basically,
Okay, we're going to call that an answer, and now you have a question.
all right, so when businesses increase prices writ large, inflation occurs, and it becomes more difficult for the poorest people to purchase goods and services. If landlords and businesses see that everyone has substantially more money, why would they not just increase prices because they know that everyone can afford it?
it's simply not substantially more money in everybody's bank account. Let's see here. Okay, we're giving, let's say, $5, $10 a month per person. I doubt that landlords would, or any predatory market would see this and initially pounce on what? The initial price increase.
You're welcome to hop in, but it counts as
Small
an answer.
amount.
So it is true that injecting any form of money into the economy will cause inflation. However, the calculated inflation rate for these types of micro UBIs in developing countries is about 1.7%, which is actually perfectly in line with the international recommendation for the ideal inflation rate of 2% in order to inspire a growing economy.
Question this way?
Yes, I have a question. The negatives state that a UBI would delve into a UBI dividend arms race among politicians. However, they also state that a UBI would also require mass taxation, which would make a UBI completely unviable as a political stance. How does the negative justify how both of these can simultaneously be true?
Well, so we've suggested that taxation is unpopular, so instead of taxing, governments would likely instead decide to cut other welfare programs in order to fund a UBI. things like welfare, running water, sanitation, etc., were all cut in Brazil when Brazil had to fund a UBI pilot.
Okay, question by the negative back to the affirmative. Somebody who hasn't, does everybody ask a question over here?
Yes.
Okay, well then, anybody that wants to go, unless we're done.
A basic income is universal, indicating that it goes to everyone, including children and the ultra-rich. Why is giving basic income to those at the top of the income ladder useful?
So that's also a great question. So in statistics, there's always going to be a trade-off between the overcoverage and the undercoverage, which means that if you naturally try and avoid giving money to people who don't need it, you're going to end up excluding those who do. And what we're talking about in developing countries is where the majority of the population needs aid. Although there is a super rich, notable population in countries such as, say, Southern Africa, the important thing to recognize is that this population is so small that unlike in the US, where the middle class and the wealthy class make up a significantly larger point of the population, the money that you save through administrative cost and not having to have the reoccurring cost of essentially verifying that people are still qualified for the program ends up outweighing the extra cost that you're giving money to the very small percentage of the population who doesn't need it.
Question from the affirmative to the negative, or are we done? No questions? Any further questions from you guys?
So you've claimed that the vast majority of populations in many developing countries are unable to afford most of their basic necessities, and that post-basic income, they would now be able to buy all of these things. Why doesn't that mean that it would be a substantial increase in demand and pressure on prices?
Well, historically, we've seen examples in universal cash transfer case studies. So in Uganda, for instance, a universal payment of around, like the minimum wage in Uganda was given to about 1,500 households, and the inflation rate as a result was like 1.7%. The recommended inflation level is 2% worldwide. So this theory that sudden inflation from supply side economic theory would suddenly arise is simply not proven historically. So.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah. So,
Okay, go ahead.
okay, Uganda was in 350 people in a rural village. What evidence do you have or case study about a national basic income in all sectors of the economy?
Well, I would love to have one, but unfortunately, if it was implemented in a national country, it wouldn't be a case study, it would simply be a policy. And why Uganda is a perfect example is because since it was in a village, it was rural, and it was a large enough scale to involve enough people to make it statistically significant, is that it involved essentially an isolated local economy, and it showed the impacts that injecting cash had into that economy, which was healthy inflation and economic growth. And so simply the scale does not matter because, again, when considering statistics, the size was still enough to make it significant, whether you scale it up to several thousand people or several million.
We have 1 minute left. Anybody got a question? Okay, we're good. We'll stop there and start with the cross-examination from the judges for a period not to exceed 20 minutes. And judges, just ask that you sort of try to distribute the questions as evenly as possible. I understand follow-ups. I understand that may get us off track a little bit, but let's see where it goes. Who's first?
Mr. Yan, you mentioned Namibia, and you relied on that in your argument. There were 2 lines of attack on that portion of your advocacy. Could you please respond to those?
Yes, so our Namibia study, let me pull up some statistics. So this program is directly exemplary of our position on this issue. It was a small UBI, so 100 Namibian dollars or $5 US, so very insignificant to us in like a first world country. But for developing nations, this means everything. This is twice the UN designated poverty line. So we believe that from the results of this study, they have shown that there have been very heavily increased participation rates in education, decreased rates of unemployment and poverty, as well as dropped crime rates. And we believe that this case study stands very strongly as a very evident explanation of our impacts.
So I agree the statistics speak for themselves, but Mr. Balakrishnan mentioned that the money came from charities. And he made the point that that made it inapposite and inapplicable. Do you have a response to that?
Yes, so this case study was not our case study for funding. This case study was about the microeconomic impacts on an isolated area. It is not supposed to represent funding. We have explained how funding is feasible previously through other means, not just charity, but this case study is not supposed to be representative of that. It is just exclusively for the economic impacts of a microscale UBI.
Yes. In essence, where the funding comes from does not matter. If you do an experiment in a lab, for example, let's say that you're testing rain on the growth of plants, the rain that you bring in is not coming from the sky, and yet the effects on the plants are very real, and that is what these case studies demonstrate. If we can prove that the financing can be done through the country's macroeconomic means, and we can prove that the impacts are real, then the case study stands.
Could I jump in on this? Maybe,
Sure.
just for a couple lines. So they said themselves, it conveys the microeconomic effects of a basic income. We are criticizing the macroeconomic effects of a basic income. The study was provided to 1,000 people in a rural town in Namibia. It's clearly not representative of countrywide scale inflation that would occur from a national policy.
So can I jump in?
Other questions? These are going to become speeches soon. Let's move on.
Are we using this? Is this working? Hello, all right. I have a question for each team. I'll start with negative. I'd like to understand the heart of your advocacy a little better if both sides are kind of agreeing that elimination of extreme poverty is a worthy goal. You seem to have presented a couple of alternatives to UBI, but you've also said, I think, like doing nothing is even better than UBI. I just want to understand if that's like the heart of your advocacy, if you would even say that just doing nothing is going to solve for poverty better than a UBI system.
I wouldn't say doing nothing, but certainly maintaining the status quo. We have a set of evidence that says that inequality and poverty are declining, and that shows that conditional targeted welfare programs are succeeding in the majority of the world. So the heart of our advocacy relies on staying true to these instruments that governments have been proven to, eliminate poverty in those ills, and by providing more funding to those, I guess.
Additionally, economic growth, things like technology globally are allowing people to pursue new careers that allow them to make more money. It's also causing global development, which increases the amount of income that people can earn, which helps them get out of poverty.
Affirmative, can I ask you real quick? How long does this program go on? Do you see this program continuing in perpetuity? Is there some threshold by which a country would evaluate poverty as this percentage, we no longer need it?
The goal of a UBI is to not need a UBI. For example, there's a reason why we didn't argue this policy in America, and that's because America's extreme poverty rate is 0.25%. Now, this is because America has experienced enough economic development that it simply does not suffer from the rates of poverty that other countries do, which happens when the country develops as a whole. And so a UBI would be a useful policy in the next 10 to 20 years, and obviously nobody can predict the economic future, in order to essentially get countries to a point where they would no longer need it because their national economies would be developed enough that the average quality of life would be raised.
So did you ever provide any analysis on where that threshold is? So if the United States is at a place where it doesn't need it, but other countries are, like I'm wondering where is that bright line specifically?
We have not defined a specific line, as that would usually be the work of countries themselves and voters, but it would be reasonable to assume that whenever the cost of implementing the UBI are no longer as relevant as their impacts, such as in the US, where you'd be reaching a very small portion, and this would likely be when only a few percentage points of the population are living in extreme poverty, then it would be reasonable to discontinue the program.
Dave?
So we're looking more at a micro versus macro level of things, right? Okay. So let's start talking about the micro level aspect of things. You're telling me that it only takes a few dollars a day or whatever to, have a significant impact, and your studies pretty much indicate that. You also seem to criticize governments for not getting things where they need to be. That seems to be kind of a macro problem that then begins to impact the micro. So given the fact that governments are the ones that are going to have to guarantee this micro level of UBI. How do you now resolve the concept that corruption may exist on the governmental level and that these people are maybe not going to get the aid that they deserve or that they need based on that and everything? So what infrastructures are you going to set up, especially since on one side you're talking about it's not political and everything, but on the other side you say that, you know, targeted aid seems to fail. And I think there seems to be some kind of targeted aid because of the infrastructure in some of these countries. So resolve that for me, because I'm kind of confused.
A key benefit of our UBI is its transparency and simplicity compared to targeted alternatives. In-kind services and conditional targeted transfers often require complex infrastructure, such as roads and national level planning and targeting individuals, determining their status, giving them the aid itself, whereas a UBI is much more simple. We just need to have a form of national registry, some form of identification, and a way of depositing money via like an electronic banking account. These systems are already in place in the large majority of developing countries, so not much is needed infrastructure-wise to set a UBI up. Whereas targeted alternatives historically have failed to cover the entire population. Only 26% coverage in developing countries from targeted means that exist right now. So
Is that because of the cost?
it's due to a lot of bureaucratic concerns, such as budget
So why
delays.
would those bureaucratic concerns disappear with your program? I mean, you begin to talk about the transparency part, you begin to talk about all of those things, but the structure is still going to be the same, right?
Yeah, but targeted aid is different in that it's perpetual. We need to perpetually identify who needs aid, how to give it, whereas a UBI is a one-time cost. We just need to set up a way to identify people and add them to a registry, and then it's automatic. So I think we'll run into less bureaucratic hurdles through the implementation of a UBI.
Additionally, this debate is about what government should do, and not necessarily what governments will do. If we only judged policy based on which outcome was most likely given the current political environment and what voters were about to do, then we would only have one option, which is what will happen immediately in the future, and then we would be fortune tellers. So because the nature of this debate is about what government should do, it's necessary to recognize that if the policy will be favorable, then it should be implemented.
So let's
Question
move
for
to
the
the other
next-
side.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, can we move to the other side real quick? Let me do that. So she just said that it's between what the government will do or could do versus should, okay? Now, your side says, hey, let's just let things go the way they are, right? That right now, you know, the first part of your case really begins to talk about, you know, that countries are beginning to, you know, we're seeing poverty levels go down. We're seeing, how's that happening? I mean, without this, I mean, if it's going to be taken care of, you're basically saying we don't need this, okay? How are we going to take care of these people in Namibia in this case study that they begin to talk about? If, you know, over the long term that you're talking about, what structures are there now to go ahead and do that?
So many of these developing countries do have conditional transfer programs. They have sorts of forms of welfare, and they provide things like infrastructure, which would also be cut if we did a basic income. Additionally, things like economic growth are increasing globally. African economic growth is expected to spike quickly soon. Indian economic growth is shoring up now because of increases in the manufacturing sector, the same with Southeast Asia, and China's already grown substantially. This means that people in those countries will start to make more money. They'll start to get better jobs, get better education, and then the percentage of poverty in those countries will substantially decrease. That is the trend of the status quo now. If we allow conditional transfers to continue, those things will happen, and that would be net better for the population because a basic income has certain political trade-offs and economic trade-offs that are substantially worse.
We can stay over here if we can. If you've got questions for the negative before we.
I do. One of the things that you mentioned was the shortage of goods as an outcome, and I didn't quite follow the argument. If you could please explain how it fits in your argument, and I'd love to hear a response to that as well.
So it's that a basic income would increase demand. Among poor people, they would demand sort of food and basic services, things like that. that would increase the amount that suppliers would need to produce, but they wouldn't be able to produce it because in the status quo, they don't have to, right? Because demand is substantially lower. When demand would spike suddenly, they would have to suddenly produce significantly more, which would cause a shortage of those goods since increasing supply infrastructure is difficult and would take a long time.
To add on to that, all of our arguments about infrastructure trade-offs with the budget, like sanitation, housing, and like roads, things like that, those are all reductions in the supply curve. And when met with the increased surge in demand, that would cause prices to rise.
And you asked for a response over here. Someone is, who spoke last? Let's have somebody new.
Yeah, so aside from misconstrued economic theory, there's no concrete evidence to prove that a UBI has any significant inflationary consequences. Given that we live in a market society, the fear that it will lead to unchecked inflation, that is UBI, is counterintuitive since competition is supported by rising purchasing power and serves to check price increases. The affirmative, or the negative that is, has never once considered how supply will increase in relation to the increased demand. So I actually, if that is acceptable, I'd like to ask the negative why this is completely infeasible.
I'd like to add something. So yes, if the demand suddenly spikes, then there will be a brief shortage, and yet the economy has a lovely way of evening itself out. And if the necessary increase in demand is what's needed to increase the supply in these rural communities for them to invest in greater manufacturing, for them to increase their output, then that is what leads to long-term economic growth right there.
Questions for the negative? Anything?
Oh, can I add on to that?
Let me,
I think we're good. If they wanted to answer that,
Yeah.
okay,
I think they should be
fire
able to.
away.
Yeah.
Okay, so the second negative constructive also read a bunch of arguments about why currently the economy is at full capacity. More demand will not increase the amount that businesses produce because they're already trying to maximize their production. There's no more resources that they can actually use, which means that because goods are scarce, even if markets wanted to produce more, they could not. They would be forced to raise prices. None of their pilot programs are about this. They're about one small village in like Kenya or Namibia. These do not account for the global supply, the global amount of resources, all of which would be used, the increased demand in every country combined at the same time would be far, far, far more than any small pilot program.
Anything else?
If you had to explain to a 5-year-old what this debate is about, what would you say? What is this debate about? How would you distill it to someone who is not quite as familiar with these issues?
I'd say that there's two things. The first one is whether a basic income is good for decreasing poverty, and the second thing is whether a basic income is good for helping the economy. And so we've made arguments about why a basic income might increase inflation. It would trade off with a bunch of services that are better for the poor and give more money proportionally. And so it would be worse for the poor and it would hurt the economy.
We've also made arguments for why hurting the economy independently would harm the poor because it would cause broad price increases that make goods harder for poor people to afford.
To a 5-year-old.
Of course. We agree with the two primary components or the key benefits of UBI, reducing poverty and economic growth. We've argued for both of these. UBI does help those in extreme poverty by providing basic, livable needs of sanitation and nutrition. And additionally, the claims of rampant inflation are simply unsubstantiated. Supply across case studies and trials of universal cash transfers has been much more elastic than the negative claims it to be. Producers are able to respond in today's economy as proven by our case studies. Thus, our economic benefits of money multipliers and increased spending are more impactful than any inflation argument.
Happy? No.
Case studies aside, and like this debate's been very grounded in pragmatics in the current status quo. We haven't talked about social contract theory, though I think Julia was starting to allude to it. But I am curious about both teams. If you approach this topic with that mindset, a social contract, designing society from the ground up, would you need a universal basic income from the get-go, not predicting the extreme poverty we see now? Can you answer that kind of more philosophically?
So Establishing a strong welfare state is important. It is important to help the poorest people in our economy, and it is important that everyone is able to be successful. But we've made arguments for why basic income is one of the most ineffective ways to do this because it causes welfare trade-offs and causes massive inflation. Building a social contract that helps the poor is important, but we think it's more effective if it would be done through status quo means of economic growth and conditional cash transfers, or through the counterplan of government investment and more conditional cash transfers or investment into them.
Yeah, we actually, thanks for bringing this up. This is a great topic to bring up because it actually defeats one of the criticisms of our case. So one of their criticisms is that if something is politically infeasible, or at least at the moment is controversial, it should not be considered, and that is their attack on UBI. And in this case, we believe that social contract theory states that the government should do the right thing for its people, and we believe that even if it is a controversial subject, even if people don't agree on it, a government should still consider this as a policy choice.
Can I jump in? Sorry. So our argument is not that a basic income is politically infeasible, so we shouldn't do it. It's rather that politicians will use a basic income to score certain political points. It's like in the world, if a basic income was implemented, certain trade-offs would occur that would make the basic income ineffective. Even when the basic income happens, regardless of whether we should do it, then politicians would cut other programs in order to fund it. They would have to. They wouldn't be forced with a choice. Even if it was theoretically better to keep all programs around, fund a basic income through taxation, or maybe just generate money into thin air, those things are not possible. It's important to keep us grounded in political reality. Even if we were to, have a basic income happen, it's important to consider all potential effects.
I will say that these political trade-offs are already present in the status quo within targeted transfers. Politicians can use different forms of targeted welfare aid to cover up any personal bias or any of their personal desires. So because UBI is transparent, it is universal, it's the same across everyone, there's no real room to change things or make up for any bias. So that's why UBI is actually more politically feasible than just a pure mix of targeted alternatives.
I actually disagree with this characterization of targeted welfare. It's given to a very specific subset of the population, whereas basic income is given to everyone, which is why politicians specifically want to give cash to everyone. It is a unique motivator that unites all voters. Whereas targeted programs, there is some backlash, there is some political trade-off with increasing welfare for the needy, because it means that people who are just above the income threshold do not benefit and will not vote for you. But with a basic income, you can get everyone to do so. And we've read multiple case studies for why cash is the unique motivator and universal cash is different from every other welfare program.
I'd like to just note that their only case study is one singular Alaskan gubernatorial election.
It's not.
I'd like to invite them to provide another case study if they could.
Yeah, the last negative speech just said that Donald Trump tried to put all of his, he bypassed a bunch of IRS and Treasury procedure that is standard reporting process to sign his name on all of the stimulus checks because he wanted voters to know, I was the one who gave you all of this money. He was very specific with this and probably violated a few laws in doing so. They are very desperate for this.
I think that's good. Thanks. Well, that seems like a good place to stop. We'll have two rebuttal speeches. They're starting with the affirmative. You have 5 minutes.
Perfect. Sorry, allow me to set up my timer.
Sure, you're better than I am. I've had 3 people try to do this and no one has succeeded, so.
All right, then I'll begin. Allow me to summarize this debate and explain why our proposal for developing countries to invest in both their citizens' well-being and their economic success is both detached and largely uncontested by the negative, and where it is contested, we come out on top. We would like to remind the judges that the negative has had access to our case for several weeks, and we are therefore puzzled by the lack of engagement with our arguments that mainly relate to developing countries, not hyperinflation or American political turmoil. Issues like unemployment and the reduction of employment base have no relation to our UBI, which we specifically outlined as a micro and not meant to substitute for full income in our framework. We reject the demand to base our UBI costs and impacts on $1,000 transfers, popular in intellectual circles, and stand by our calculations and case studies, which were made on tens of dollars. We say that a cheap UBI is not impossible, it's a policy. With this out of the way, the negative's core arguments against the UBI rely on three factors: political instability, mass inflation, and the need to cut other effective forms of welfare. Before we can address these, however, we have to reinstate our justified framing of the debate. The negative has tried to disqualify our argument by saying that it's wrong to create policy that excludes high-income countries by focusing on 85% of the world that live in developing countries. We would like to say that the absence of fires does not diminish the importance of firemen. If UBI, which is a policy best used for eliminating extreme poverty and promoting economic development, is not useful in the minority of countries with little to no extreme poverty and highly developed economies, that is not an argument against whether the policy is, in fact, helpful, and whether it should be implemented in the majority of countries that stand to benefit from it, which it should. Now, let's talk about political instability. A widely transparent and visible policy is indeed subject to more public scrutiny and voter sway, but this is a good thing. Rather than surreptitiously cut certain programs in the shadows, as often happens with welfare, UBI involves every citizen in the decision-making. While it runs the risk of developing single-issue elections, as seen with the Alaska Fund, these are short-term issues. There's a reason we look back on Alaska as a mistake, and why it hasn't been repeated. Citizens realize the trade-offs of their voting, and it's diminutive to assume that a consensus over the balance of UBI and other programs can't be understood by the average voter. Let them make their mistakes if it comes to be, but understand that they will learn and adapt. Now let's address the negative second argument, mass inflation. We showed that inflation in developing economies would be minimal to non-existent, likely at around 1.7%. The negative was unable to comment on the empirical evidence against their claims, other than insist that it must be false. The inflation case study we mentioned was indeed trialed in a rural village, where inflation theoretically should be the highest, given that UBI's comparative increased purchasing power is greater there. Saying that low inflation in the poorest areas of a country would somehow snowball to large inflation macroeconomically is simply a false economic claim. Coincidentally, this inflation rate is again also the healthy 2% rate that is recommended for economies to grow, which is what we're trying to argue for. Therefore, inflation works in favor of our proposal and not against it. As for the negative's third argument about eliminating welfare, we're proposing a UBI that does not necessitate cuts to other programs. We agree that targeted welfare, and especially infrastructure projects in developing countries, are important, but these policies can coexist alongside a base needs UBI. The price to implement this type of UBI is significantly smaller than other proposals, although still nothing to sneeze about, but this price is far worth it for the gains in human welfare and long-term economic growth. The idea of eliminating welfare is therefore irrelevant to these contexts. On that note, we'd like to reinstate what UBI does for a country. UBI, as a small unconditional payment that serves as a baseline aid for food and sanitation, first helps citizens feed themselves and improve their health. The cash injection into communities benefits from a spending multiplier that makes aid more efficient, and yet incurs minimal, healthy inflation that is representative of a strengthening economy. The majority who live in poverty in developing nations benefit from a UBI which funnels money into their local economies, increases demand for local businesses, and eventually allows them to stand as markets on their own. The minimal aid lost by giving a UBI to the very small but highly wealthy populations in these countries is evened out by the reduction in administrative fees and lack of recurring costs to renew eligibility. With this, UBI is an investment to end itself and to end extreme poverty. The ideal UBI is a policy that won't be necessary in 10 years. Even if we are in a positive trajectory to ending extreme poverty, we can end it sooner. Why aim for 2050 when we can do it by 2040? UBI is not a panacea, but it is far from snake oil. It is the base aid, the rice in your bowl, the water in your cup that enables the people of the country to take advantage of the infrastructure programs, of the education, of all the other social programs that UBI will work together with to end extreme poverty once and for all. We therefore urge you to vote affirmative. Thank you.
Negative, we're going to give you an extra minute, and then we're going to give you guys 1 minute at the end of that. We had those flipped. So that's the way it is during all the written debates, and I just wrote it down that way. It's my fault. So you guys get an extra minute, and you'll get a minute additional rebuttal.
Okay.
Make sense? Okay, go ahead.
All right. There are two questions you must answer to evaluate this debate. 1, is a basic income good for the economy? 2, is it good to solve inequality? The answer to both is no. A basic income destroys societal cohesion. It promotes a race to increase the UBI, causing irresponsible cuts to the budget, all while massively increasing demand pressures in the economy. In developing countries which have no ability to raise taxes or deficit spend, critical services like running water, sanitation, healthcare, housing, and education would be shut down, trapping the most vulnerable people in a cycle of violence and poverty. In developed countries, a massive safety net that specifically targets the poor along with infrastructure would be removed, making the total effect of a basic income worse on the poor. Now, our evidence is about a micro UBI. The Brazil example provided $60 a month to people, which was very small for Brazilian standards, and often was cited as not providing enough to meet their basic needs. Well, they have said that the basic income will be enough to meet basic needs, which means that their example is much, much larger than ours. Now, there's a universal political trade-off across the world that would happen regardless of the size of the basic income. Brazil, Alaska, and the stimulus check with Trump all prove that the policy would be an opportunity to increase the basic income in the future, regardless of how big it was, because politicians could always promise to give more. This is bad. Voters are lied to about which piece of welfare gets cut, what parts of budgets trade off, which is proven by Alaska. Now, they have just lied that Alaska was remedied. Dunleavy has recently won another election and is still popular despite the state becoming poorer. Meanwhile, other case studies, such as Trump during the COVID-19 pandemic, have been fully ignored by the affirmative. Don't ignore political reality. Now, they're wrong about the Uganda example. The minimum wage was $2.50 an hour, while the basic income provided by the pilot was $16 a month. This is not significant. It is not enough to get them to work for a day and would not cause substantial inflation. It is not close to the basic income that we have said their basic income would lead to. It must be enough to cover every basic service. That scales. $2 in the US is not the same as $2 in Uganda, so even a basic income of low amount would still cause massive inflation, especially when it would cause bottlenecks in many markets as it would increase the amount of people who could afford these products. Declaring the UBI to be small does not mean that it is non-inflationary. Businesses would increase their prices by a marginal amount if they knew that everyone could afford their services. Davidson's only response is that they doubt businesses would do so. This has no warrant and does not assume the fact of a massive increase across the board, across the globe. If a few farmers bought slightly more in one village, this would not stress the global supply chain. But if everybody did at the same rate, it would. Now, you must prioritize a stable and growing economy. Countries are rapidly developing. Global inequality across nearly every possible factor, including democratic freedom, access to resources, health, education, income, have all decreased by more than a third in the last generation. Only our side has evidence for this claim. They have no evidence for why poverty is not decreasing, while our study accounts for nearly every possible factor and indicator of development and finds that there have been massive improvements. This is the future that governments throw away by going for the magic solution of a basic income. Now, the scale does matter for evaluating it. Inflation effects have changed based on the type of economy, and our evidence is about the global economy and says that during COVID, supply chains were stressed, they were shocked, and because of this, we could not produce anymore. When we tried to give stimulus and universal cash, it did not work. Inflation increased by upwards of 10%, which has never happened in the past decade. They might be right that for some isolated village there's a shortage of cash, but those are not about the global economy. Now, the terms and burdens. The resolution says that governments should provide a basic income, which is every government, including developed and developing countries, though the most likely way that, through the most likely way that they would implement it. They do not get to choose which country should adopt a basic income. That would justify affirmative simply providing a basic income in one or two countries, or part of a country or a city, which is ridiculous and unanswerable. The resolution calls for a basic income in governments generally, which separates the IPPF from other competitions. It also is important to consider political trade-offs. The topic only says that governments should provide a basic income and does not cover specify funding mechanisms of any sort. We've read arguments that say that the logical political consensus of providing a basic income would be cutting other welfare programs. Anything else ignores political reality. Taxes are unpopular and would not be able to be implemented. Now, their next argument about responsible financing. Davidson has perfectly encapsulated their argument when in cross they said that, quote, the funding does not matter. When evaluating the macroeconomic effects of the plan, this is the pinnacle of feckless budget logic that will deprive billions of people from running water, sanitation, and basic services, all of which are far more valuable than $2.50 a month. Difficulties with financing are a central part of the basic income debate, so you should consider all of these arguments. Do not let them imagine a way out of reasonable opportunity cost to their policy, as one reason for why many policies are chosen are because they are politically popular and easy to fund. There is only a few basic incomes, and all of them have resulted in political opportunism. Now, our argument is not that we should omit a BI because it's unpopular, but rather that we should consider the trade-offs and consequences of our action, something that every policymaker needs to do. There are unique political trade-offs, and cash is a unique motivator because it benefits all of the population, which is different from targeted welfare policy. they have no example about a government that would not take advantage of a basic income. This is very important because it means that any argument that there would be no political trade-off is just wishing away what actually has happened through the past. Frame this specific argument through empirics. All of their arguments are theoretical studies or studies that were not governed by governments but rather by charities. We are the only team that is providing an example of how a basic income played out with funding. Their authors are biased and want a basic income to happen, while our evidence is empirical reality. Thus we negate.
Time. So a minute, you're welcome to go ahead and do it because all three of you have given a speech. Go ahead.
Perfect. The negative has worked tirelessly and quite commendably to misconstrue the UBI that we propose. We would like to once again reiterate that all of our case studies are based off of the nominal amounts that we have also based our economic calculations on, and that all of these still hold, such as the Namibia case study where the cash injection was minimal and it had significant impacts. Now, we also do not propose a UBI that can cover education, advanced health care, a fancy apartment, but that's because we're arguing for a UBI to end extreme poverty. And what people need in extreme poverty is food and sanitation, which is what our UBI covers. Now, to address their other claims, the essence of political corruption is once again derived from America and ignores the fact that the political base in these countries is very different, where the majority of people do stand to benefit from the UBI, but may not necessarily require as much. It's a lot different, $1,000 versus $5. And so with that, we urge you to affirm again. Thank you.
Westwood High School. The judges will now have an opportunity to vote for the school they believe should advance to the IPPF finals and take on Ivy Bridge Academy. So in a few minutes, we will announce the advancing team and flip for sides for the final debate.
We didn't get as cooked as we could have. What is the social contract? This is history.
Forgot about history class. That's crazy.
All right, time to lock in. I think we're probably still gonna lose, but
yours, I guess.
Hers is the only one that counts. You know, so, especially since you and I agreed we were gonna split. so,
Exactly.
Just kidding.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, before we announce the winner, let's give both the teams a big round of applause. In the debate between Davidson Academy of Nevada and Westwood High School advances by a vote of 2-1. We would now like to invite Ivy Bridge Academy and Westwood to come to the center. We're going to flip sides for the final debate, which will take place here at 3:30 p.m. For those of you in the audience that you're staying for lunch, we will have a buffet in the room in the back, and then you can go upstairs to Rockefeller and have lunch. Again, the final debate starts at 3:30.
The second from your speech was more everything else will be the same. Extend my case, but I'm really not going to answer what they were saying.
Yes, you all know the same one.
I had concerns after the second final.
Yeah, because it was like,
Especially, I like what she said.
Will be affirmative.
They think poverty's going to end by 2050. Well, at least we're going to